Welcome to another episode of Unfiltered AI Leadership. I'm so excited today to be joined by Steve West. He heads up Healthliant Ventures, which is the venture arm of Tanner Health System, and really sits at the juncture of innovation and venture activities connected to the health system, which is a rural and regional system, sort of at the Georgia-Alabama border. And one of the reasons I was particularly excited for this conversation is that so much in healthcare AI happens often in academic medical centers or in sort of the innovation heavy coastal systems. But the reality is that most healthcare is actually delivered in these sort of regional community systems under enormous operational pressure. So I want to unpack some of those ideas today. So thank you so much, first of all, Steve, for joining.
No, happy to be here. Thanks for having me,
Yeah.
Harris.
So for people unfamiliar with Tanner, can you tell us a little bit about the scale of the organization, the communities you serve, and then more importantly, how do you think about your role in the middle of all of that?
Sure. So Tanner Health is a 5 hospital system outside of Atlanta, Georgia, right? Going all the way into eastern Alabama. So for folks that are good with geography, we're right outside on the western side of the 285 kind of ring road around Atlanta. And so we have a really interesting mix of suburban and rural populations. So we do about $1 billion in net patient revenue. We serve anywhere between 300 to 500,000 patients across a pretty large catchment area. And, we provide all of the services other than kind of very specialty things like, advanced pediatric care, very specialty things, subspecialties in that, and pediatrics and things like transplants. But other than that, from cradle to grave, we serve our patient community and try to provide the best care possible. And so our 4 med-surg hospitals, 1 inpatient behavioral health hospital. We have one of the largest psychiatric super groups in the Southeast. We have one of the largest employed medical groups in the Southeast. And so, for us, it's always trying to figure out how we can provide better care to patients in a very competitive environment at the Atlanta area. We've got a lot of large systems around us. And so for us, it's always trying to figure out what's going to be the thing that makes someone choose Tanner over some opportunities, to go to other places that may have bigger names or may, have a strong pull in some way for these patients. My role is really a facilitator. I look at my background before. I didn't come from finance, have a ventures hat in the Tanner side in Healthliant Ventures, but I don't really have a finance background. My background has always been in product management for technology companies, healthcare companies, my entire career, the advisory board, Anthem, a few other companies there. And so I really look at how we're helping Tanner from an innovation perspective in the same way that I looked at building products in my previous career stints. What are the pain points that folks have? How does the process exist today? Is the workflow good, bad, ugly? Where can we optimize? Or are there opportunities that we're maybe not capturing that if we figured out a way or figured out a solution that we could plug in, we could provide that much better service to folks? And so I always start by that facilitation function of saying, what are the folks that are on the ground floor, right? Our doctors, our nurses, our techs, our administrators, what are they saying their biggest pain points are? And if you start from there, you get a really good sense of, well, what are the patterns that exist across the organization that I could try to bring together from an innovation standpoint and find partnerships with companies that are solving not just what's happening today, but also what this problem's going to look like 3 to 5 years from now. I think that's where I try to lend a bit of perspective to the folks that have the problem every day.
Perfect. That's a really helpful context and background that I want to dig into a little bit more about what you highlighted about the sort of the Tanner specific context in comparison to some of the other health systems in your geography. But before I get there, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your background in product and now your sort of role as this facilitator. Um, was that sort of a natural transition, or were there 1 or 2 things that you had to pick up when you transitioned into this role?
Definitely had to pick up a lot. The culture of a health system is very different than the culture of a startup or even a
Mm,
mid-size healthcare company. The incentives are just different, right? Health systems prioritize stability and ensuring that the core is ultimately taken care of. With health systems, the margins are lower, right? So your margins are in the single digits as opposed to technology companies that are in 50, 60, 70, 80% range, right? So the ability to kind of move faster and allocate resources is a very different thing. And while Tanner is an incredibly entrepreneurial place, I'd say that we've streamlined bureaucracy pretty well. We don't
Mm.
have committee dysfunction the way a lot of health systems do. And I attribute that to our senior leadership team that's very forward thinking in that regard. You still have to get a lot of folks on board to drive a solution as opposed to, product management, where depending on, your role in the organization, how you've been given a mandate by the CEO, you could be the tip of the spear and have a fair amount of agency in being able to get something done. But I've also had roles in product management where I'm the platform guy. I started
Mm.
my career in a supply chain management role where the platform was the hardest part of it. I was serving, it was kind of an interesting something. It was how do I serve universities on supply
Mm.
chain, US hospitals, a new kind of managed service for this, and then UK hospitals on supply chain. And so when
Oh,
you're
wow.
trying to balance all those platforms, everybody has different budget lines. It's game theory around, well, what does everybody want? How do I align interests? All of that. I almost had to go back to that version of product management when I came to the
Yeah.
health system, as opposed to the version of product management where I was the go to market guy. And the CEO is like, Steve, go figure out the problem. Talk to all these customers, make it happen. You have engineering resources, do it. Those are two different environments in which to operate in. And so going back to the roots of platform product management was really something I needed to embrace when I came into the health system.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a really great juxtaposition of those two kinds of product management. And then obviously, like you mentioned, a lot of it is driven by the context within which you're operating in. And so like you said, Tanner's a sort of a regional rural system. So can you tell us from your perspective, what's different fundamentally in terms of how it operates compared to, say, like a large academic center?
Yeah. So to put in context for folks, about 15% of patient care in the US is provided by academic medical centers. But
Mm.
85% is more of the community driven piece, right? So when you're thinking about kind of the larger part of where this is provided, or where care is provided, it's happening in places like Tanner. Whether
Yeah.
they're the size of Tanner, a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger, right? We don't all have that academic focus in the same way. And there are different incentives as a result of that. Academics tend to have a lot more protected time for clinicians and researchers to go after activities that are of interest to them because that brings prestige to the organization, that brings grants to the organization. It may attract med students and residents if they're, a teaching hospital. So there's kind of an interesting carve out time. It's kind of like Google's 20% or
Oh,
10%
yes. Yeah.
time always where these folks can take on additional activities. Folks join health systems, community health systems because they want to be at the ground floor of patient care. We don't protect time. The goal for us is to be able to provide as much efficiency of care as much as like we're looking at kind of the creme de la creme of unique processes. We know that we're not going to be able to provide the most specialty things. And that's why we're thankful to be in a clinically integrated network with Emory that can provide our patients those types of services if need be. Now, we want to be able to offer as much as we can, but not always possible. So, efficiency, operational movement, making sure there's ease of access, those are the bread and butter issues that we're trying to solve every day. Whereas companies that are coming in and academic medical centers and trying to understand the desires there, that may be something where they're trying to do something more. Those clinicians are trying to get to some greater quality outcome, as opposed to for us, we're looking at how can I provide as much of the excellent quality care. I don't need to go on the bleeding edge, but I need to be able to do more of it in a way that is not going to kind of break down the entire system.
Yeah.
And the financial pressures there, we are incented to do that in a much more interesting way, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, and it leads really nicely onto my next question, which is, when you, particularly in your role, where you're sort of at the coalface of innovation into this sort of ground level healthcare delivery, when you have people from Silicon Valley or from London or wherever, venture backed AI companies come to you at the health system, what do you think that they systematically misunderstand about how hospitals like Tanner operate compared to the academics? And has that changed over time? Like, have things gotten better? Aside from what you just mentioned about sort of the creme de la creme of sort of medical practice, what else do they sort of often misunderstand? And is it getting better?
Yeah. So I'd say that most companies come to us, when I see a pitch from a random company, and I'm not going to say that it's mostly Silicon Valley or London or
Okay.
anybody else. I'd say
Yeah.
that folks come with a pitch that's technology first rather than problem first. And
Mm,
for us, we're looking at it as like, can you solve the problem in a meaningful way? We're so used to seeing medical device pitches from reps or, something where it's like, the technology is just so much different. And we always ask, okay, what are the patient outcomes? What are the costs? All of these types of things. Everybody's been trained in the organization to kind of
yeah.
move beyond the pure technology. I think that where folks and companies really underestimate how systems work is, they go from an academic medical center where maybe there's a research component of this. You're on the cutting edge, it's grant funding, it's not really hitting somebody's budget in that way, and they have to make sure that you can charge that year after year to get that recurring revenue. What most folks miss is what are the incentives or disincentives for different folks in the organization to say yes to a solution. So everybody goes and they say, okay, well, I need to talk to the business leader. I have the clinician, maybe. I then need to go to IT. I need to go to finance. I need to go to compliance. You don't do that in kind of sequence. That's not
Yeah.
how you get something through. You have to figure out how to break down the process and have multiple people in the meeting at the right time. How do you have the business operators and the clinicians there at the same time? How do you have IT and compliance talking to each other? How have you already secured the budget? Do you have a champion in the organization that knows how to? I cannot stress this enough.
Mm,
Champions that know how to buy in a health system are very rare. Maybe it's less than, well, fewer, because it's really only a select few of folks. And 20 people in your average health system know how to buy something end to end.
yeah.
Trying to
Can I?
find those is really hard.
Yeah, just to interrupt, sorry, Steve, on that point. So
Yeah.
this concept of champion has always interested me for years because I spent most of my career as a champion for AI inside my own hospital. But I always felt that this sort of champion driven purchasing was a kind of system failure, which is, like you say, like if we are problem driven, then whoever owns that problem and all the different stakeholders, like it should be a rational process, right? It should just follow the normal process, whatever committee or budget holder has to sign off and whatever evaluation has to happen just happens. When in reality, champions have to sort of bend over backwards to almost force things through the different processes or sometimes run over processes. Or do you see it differently?
So I agree with you in the sense of a traditional vendor relationship that most
Mm,
folks have. If you're a large enterprise vendor, you're well capitalized, you know that you're just trying to increase your market share percentage by and percentage over time. That existing infrastructure where you don't require champions, you just go through institutional kind of momentum as slow as it is, that works for you, right?
mm,
Because a health system is buying off of a risk mitigation plan, right? How do they make this as least risky as possible? Whereas startups, you're thinking in 18-month sales cycles because you have 18-month funding cycles. If you don't close something in 12 to 18 months, you can't show the progress needed to raise more money. So with smaller companies, yes, there's you have to have a champion that bends over backwards. It seems very frustrating that they have to do it, but that's the only way to move beyond the traditional inertia that exists in the system. And so love it or hate it, it's kind of the same thing as regulatory capture that happens with larger companies elsewhere in the States, which is, well, I'm just going to lobby my representatives to try to make it harder for new entrants to come in. That's similar to what happens in most health systems, where it's like, well, I'm Epic, I'm Oracle, I'm Microsoft, I'm name your large vendor here. How can I make it so that we're adding almost more checkpoints that only we have the resources to really take on and get through efficiently? So yeah,
yeah.
I understand the critique. I don't like it either, but I think that's why we're starting to see some interesting kind of breakthroughs from certain types of technologies, ambient listening, et cetera, that they're learning on how quickly they can get through some of these things when you have the right motivated champion.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Following that similar thread, what operational pressures and then other realities exist now for community health systems that have made or that have become so severe that AI is moving from, that's interesting to genuinely necessary? What are some of those pressures locally now?
Yeah, so I think there's a few. So let me talk about it in the context of we'll talk about it in the context of recent financial pressures. I think that
Mm,
it made this very difficult. Everybody's heard of Big Beautiful Bill. There's not
yeah.
really a lot of beneficial things in there. I mean, compared to the Medicaid cuts of $800 billion, the Rural Transformation Fund of $50 billion just really doesn't cut it. That's going to see our Medicaid margins go down. And already, we can't survive on pure government payer rates. If we see that margin go down further, that puts strain on the rest of commercial. At the same time, earlier this year, the ACA subsidies were not extended. So in Georgia, for example, we're seeing 40% of people that were on a marketplace plan. And a lot of these folks are, at small companies. If you're fewer than 20 employees, you don't have to provide health insurance to your employees. And so they say, go out to the market. Well, when you're seeing your monthly plan go from $1,000 to $3,000 at the same time that gas prices are going up, food costs are going up, everything's going up, and your salary is staying the same, you're saying, I'm just going to go without health care
Mm,
on this. But what that's meant for us is that we're probably seeing 5, 7, 9% drop in commercial volumes. And that commercial volume is what subsidizes, and those rates subsidize our Medicaid populations, or Medicare populations, or Medicare Advantage populations, or self-pay populations. Those are the types of things where we're going to start seeing 3, 4, 5% margin cuts holistically over the next year. So if you make less than 5% margins right now as a health system, you are likely to go underwater this year. The problem is that 80% of hospitals exist under those 5% margins. So how are we going to sustain that long term? So then the question is, okay, you've got decreasing margins and labor costs are going up at the same time. Now, that's just a natural thing. The payers are squeezing us a lot more, either visibly by trying to kind of make harder for us on the contract rates, or invisibly by ratcheting up our denial rates, making prior authorizations a little harder. It just feels like we're getting more and more into a war over every dollar. And
mm,
so AI for us seems like a panacea. Is it? I don't know. Where as we get more and more adversarial in our relationships, we just have to be smarter or faster about identifying opportunities to improve. I mean, AI prior authorization is a perfect example. I mean, if this is just going to get into high frequency trading type activity where payers over the last few years have started updating their policies not just once a quarter, but once every month, every week. Does it get down to days? Does it get down to hours? Who can keep up with that from a human perspective? We're going to need something to take on that labor. And so I think for us, we look at AI as a potential fix. Now, are we seeing it holistically in everything that we do across all of our pilots and our programs? No, it's very uneven. But I have to believe that it's going to only get better from here once folks truly understand that it's not just a replacement for a particular part of a workflow, rather than, as much as my CIO hates the word reimagination, it is a reimagination of what that workflow should actually look like given the constraints in which we exist today.
yeah, no, I completely agree, particularly on that last point. Or for health systems to capture the value, you have to reimagine how you're doing that work. Otherwise, the gains you're going to get are really marginal. And yeah, really fascinating reminder around the CMS cuts. I mean, it's the case for every developed health system, is that they're fundamentally unaffordable in the way that they operate today. Whether they're sort of the US model, or here in Europe, and in the UK, everyone is trying to figure out how do you do more with less. And AI and automation has to be the answer because there aren't many
Yeah.
other answers. It reminded me also, I was at a meeting in DC last week, and Steve Parente, who was an advisor to the first Trump administration around health economics, he had a price transparency app
Yeah.
called, I think it's called My MedVita or something like that. And he showed me locally the reimbursement rates for a brain MRI. And the thing that was most striking to me was it showed the CMS reimbursement and it was lower than the UK NHS costs. And I was like, wow. I was like, we are famously lean system in the UK. And, in some, the CMS reimbursement rate is lower than that. And that was like the red alarm for me.
Yeah, I think that most folks internationally, and I mean, this is one of the reasons we do a fair amount of work with international companies. There's so much to impart on a revenue cycle basis or understanding costs, understanding reimbursements for regulated products on this side. Most folks, the NHS, Australia, most, single payer, multi-payer, government sponsored health systems, it's
Mm,
activity based funding, right? So it's, you provide this, you get this number, right? For
mm,
us, it's a mix. It's
yeah.
if your commercial rates are 2x for a particular procedure, that's the thing that subsidizes you. And if, commercial volumes are going down, well, that mix hurts.
Yeah.
And companies have gotten really good at pricing like up till that limit where they're capturing 96, 97% of that value and your margin is that 3 or 4%. That's going to be very different when you start seeing the collapse of more commercial business. And
Yes.
so a lot of companies are going to have to fundamentally change their business models to take this into account. You can't put nearly as much money into your sales organization. All those pricey AI engineers that you're hiring, they may not be as affordable anymore. You may be thinking about token maxing a little bit less. There's a whole lot of things that you have to take into account on that side because folks like us are going to be looking at not just does this provide the outcome, but is it for the right price?
Yes, yeah, no, exactly. And obviously, Tanner recently announced the partnership with Ethernet around AI-powered prior authorization workflows. I mean, I was going to ask, why did that use case matter enough to operationalize? But I think you've already made the case pretty strongly. But I wonder if there's any more detail around some of the benefits that you hope to get out of that work.
Yeah. So for us, it's not necessarily about a streamlining or firing people, right? Like
Mm,
that's absolutely not the goal. And, our CFO, Carol Cruz, has been insistent on this from day one. We've got to cut, right? We always have to stay lean, but we have to be smart about how we do it, right?
yeah.
And it doesn't involve pulling people out of where they are. It may just mean that we don't hire as quickly in the future because we are growing still very quickly. The reality for EtherMed came down to a couple of different things. So, number one, a prior authorization may take 3, 4, 5 days, in total, but that's about 30 minutes to an hour's worth of work for a practice assistant that's running it, right? And a lot of it's just manual matching on the clinical data for a payer application. And that's a perfect thing for AI to take on. And so if you can take 30 minutes or an hour per prior authorization and turn that into a 1 minute type exercise, well, where do you allocate that person? We're not going to fire that person. It just means that all of the other backlogged work we have around scanning
Yes.
documents or making sure folks are going to show up for their visits, actual human to human contact in the physician
Yeah.
offices, which maybe gets kind of put secondary to the other types of things we have to do administratively. That can happen. So
Yeah.
we're looking at ways that we can be better utilizing those folks in a more human capacity.
Mm,
Humans are not meant to take data from database to database and copy and paste. That's just not what our function is best at, right? That's what AI is really good at. And we get back to the human side of care is what AI can enable us to do. So that's what I think about when I think of prior authorization is we don't want to take away the things that matter. We just want
mm,
to reduce the amount of things that don't really matter in the context of how a patient experiences service at Tanner. It's going to change how we allocate things in the long run. We've started co-building a company with Redesign Health called Worky, and Craig and Harvey are unbelievable co-founders. One of the things that we're working on are career pathways in the age of
mm,
AI. What are the things that are most likely to going to be disrupted by AI in the next few years? How are we going to need to change our job roles to account for these things? How do we get people going from A to B in terms of their next career path? Because this is going to be disruption, whether we like it or not. Is it going to be like Armageddon style disruption? I don't think so. But we do have a mission to ensure that our employees who are valuable folks in our organization know what's next and what they can take on given the skills they have without being worried that they're going to be disrupted by the next model update from Anthropic or OpenAI.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree. And that last bit is a really important framing as well. I do think, I completely agree, it's going to be incredibly disruptive in a net positive way, right?
Yeah.
And I, especially recently, have just been reflecting a lot on like the advent of computers in general. And I think about all the different generations that computers went through, like with punch cards first. And so you had like sort of the first iteration of computers, which was still kind of intuitive. It's like I can see, the light going through holes. I kind of understand what's happening. And then they get to a level of a complexity, like a MacBook, where you're like, I have no idea what's happening inside, right? And then the professions alongside it
Yeah.
have radically evolved, where people who use MacBook today would look like aliens to the people who use punch card computers. And I think the same thing's going to happen with AI. Like in the early days when people had neural networks, sort of in the early 2000s in healthcare, we still kind of understood what was happening, sort of pattern matching and like highlighting blobs in images. But it's going to end up in a place where it looks completely alien. It's going to be like punch card versus
Oh, yeah.
MacBook. Yeah.
Yeah, I
And yeah,
agree. I
yeah,
agree. But there's also like, you get to different levels of abstraction where it is
yeah,
necessary or not. Like nobody does like manual memory compiling. Like nobody
yeah, exactly.
compiles code anymore manually as a program.
Yes.
We've just accepted that something can do that in an automated way. It's the same thing here. It's like, why are we doing all of this data entry? The company that I started was on data cleaning and data transformation. It's like, why is somebody aligning manually 17 different ways to spell Coca-Cola Inc., right? Like that's a waste of people's time. That's something that can be done a little bit better. We've just accepted that that's what progress looks like. But I actually, over the past few months, with some of the Opus 4.6 and all of the stuff
Mm,
around work and Claude Code, which I love. I love the agentic work. We're doing a lot of agentic work at Healthliant Ventures right now to speed up financial modeling and a lot of other things.
mm,
I am not seeing the evolution in kind of the doomsday predictions of like the models are getting this much smarter, they're getting this much more creative. You're able to one shot prompts a lot better. I think almost the more we can protract this out, the better off we're going to be. If it looks more like an industrial revolution type time frame, as opposed to like complete sea change, like
yeah,
COVID level disruption,
yeah,
right? Better off we're going to be, the better off we're going to be able to retrain because folks are obviously scared of this. Like,
yeah.
I look at the difference between how our directors and our VPs talk about AI versus our entry level folks that are, Gen Z, I think emerging Gen Alpha. I mean, these folks are asking, gosh, we're destroying the environment with data centers. There's so many privacy concerns. Like, am I going to have a job next? Or am I just going to be just reduced to an agent? I mean, there's a lot of anxiety about it. I hope that a longer term like movement on this agentic piece is going to be more beneficial for folks' sense of well-being long term.
Yes, yes, which is important. Yes, yeah. Mm. You also mentioned earlier that, like across your AI portfolio, there's variability. Some things are going well, and some things just naturally don't live up to the promise. And sometimes that's local things, and sometimes that's for other reasons. But now, having been through that cycle a few times, what are some of the sort of like hallmarks or characteristics of something which makes a good demo versus something that's actually going to survive operational reality inside the health system?
Yeah. So I find that when folks are much more prescriptive about the type of workflow that they should have, and that's usually a flashier demo that's like,
Mm,
oh, you could do this, and this in a flashy way, it gets people to buy, but people underestimate the reality of what that does. So it's kind of when folks go to the CIO or they go to the CFO and they say, I've got this great solution. Yes, you got this meeting with a buyer persona that could buy today, has the budget authority, right? But then when they say, oh, go down to this person that runs the oncology service line, then it just falls apart because the flashiness belies all of the complexity about making the clinical workflow actually
mm,
function. And so those folks that come in and they say, listen, this is maybe not as flashy as you're used to, but this is what we've understood about what the physician has said about what they need in this case. We want to learn specifically how you do this. The folks that came in and essentially provided a micro consulting service around clinical workflow, right?
Mm.
Or any of the workflow pieces we needed, those have been the most successful by far. And it's not just because they understand better or they've got kind of a learning competency that's really helpful. It's that they actually built out the kind of the trust that,
Mm.
hey, we're both trying to solve the problem together. It's not, me versus you, it's us versus the problem. Those have been the things where we're like, wow, we had a quick implementation. The pilot took a month instead of 3 months. And, our employees feel super supported by this. Those are the ones that really work. Don't lose your curiosity and your willingness to learn just because you now have 5 customers, health system customers, instead of 1 or
Yeah.
0 or 10 or 20, right? Those are the types of things that, you're trying to mimic a large enterprise vendor, but it doesn't make you uniquely what's gonna, kind of keep the excitement long term if you're a smaller startup. Those are, I think, the types of things. I think we're also seeing more unique pressures as well, where we're
Mm.
trying to get to ROI in 90 days or less on a lot of these more functional tools. Infrastructure is a little bit different. I think clinical is a little bit different. But if you're looking at like AI in the rev cycle, we need to see that pretty quick. Otherwise, it's just not going to work and we're not going to get the word of mouth internally to sustain the momentum. There's a lot of different things there. I probably am better about saying what not to do than what to do because every company is very different in terms of the culture of the founder, the culture of the team, and how they approach things given where their solution exists in the kind of ecosystem.
Yeah, no, it's very helpful. And that sort of like nugget that you mentioned, which is basically talk to the user and understand them. And it's such a, it's almost it is a cliche of the startup world in general, right? Which we seem to forget when it comes to healthcare startups, right? Like the being user obsessed and, doing things that don't scale, like consulting, for example, and doing education and learning and all of that sort of stuff is something that you sort of read in the sort of startup 101 textbooks, right? But it feels like when you meet sort of health tech startups, they sort of forget that and they put on a shiny
Yeah,
suit and the glossy slides and making all sorts of assumptions. And in fact, healthcare is the worst place to do that because there is so much heterogeneity and you can sell to 100 health systems and first will trip you up because they practice differently or they do things differently.
that's right. The joke is once you've seen one health system, you've seen one health system, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not, there's not a lot of cultural kind of homogeneity, right?
Yeah.
Around this particular type of organization. I think you're exactly right, is that people are very quick to, say, well, let's try to solve this like a consumer play. And I see a lot of consumer health companies right now, I guess maybe we're timing this a little bit. Google announces their $99 Fitbit and all of that. And oh, we're
Yeah.
going to be able to connect to your medical records. We're going to be able to do all of these other types of things, right? And they look at it as a consumer problem when ultimately it's a very structural problem. It's not the consumer that is driving this. You have 17 different users that you have to engage simultaneously and balance out what their particular needs are on all sides. And so there's, a whole joke around, how startups go is like, I try to solve this one pain point. I realize nobody buys this pain point in isolation because I haven't done enough user research. Oh, then I need to become and build a new EMR to be able to
Yes.
function on this. And then up doesn't work. Let me become a services company. Right. Like that's
Yes.
the trope about how this works because
Yeah.
you realize that it's like so hard to actually build a company if you don't understand all of the user motivations and the friction points that exist there. What I often tell a lot of startups that are earlier stage or kind of mid their first product is that it is more important that you get into the health system with a consulting contract that people trust you, they want to work with you, and then you figure out your problem from there, as opposed to coming in with a strong viewpoint on what your product is, failing in the pilot, and because you were so dogmatic about what you thought you solved, you then have lost your ability to ask for a pivot later.
Mm.
And I think that's really it, is that folks in a health system want to work with you. We have limited time, we have limited dollars, but there are folks in the organization that are going to make this this happen for you, assuming you come in with the right mentality.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Something else I want to pick up on that you just mentioned, it's attention that I feel, and I know lots of other innovators and health systems feel as well, which is the tension between integration and innovation. And what I mean by that, and I'm going to ask you a very specific question off the back of it, is often you'll come across technologies which sometimes don't fit in to the existing workflow, and sometimes on purpose, right? It might require you to set up a new service or do a new process, take a new sample or a different kind of biopsy or something in order to get the biomarker, the output, the test result or something, right? And that creates a huge hurdle, right? Because hey, if you're going to ask me to do an extra patient visit or take an extra biopsy or do something different to how I deliver my normal clinical practice, then I'm going to need to see or have a lot of confidence in the potential benefit or outcome or ROI. And then you have other solutions where they're way more seamless and they blend in with the practice and they integrate with the EMR and they don't ruffle any feathers. But then the question is are you really innovating, right? Or are you just doing more of the same? And I'm going to ask you about this in the context of ambient scribes, right? And particularly with the
Thinking
rollout
you might
of,
get to this one.
yeah, with the EHR companies coming out with their sort of more native solutions. And obviously you had the fast starts from the innovative independents like, Abridge, Ambience, etc. And then, frankly, obviously I speak to lots of health system folk who are using a lot of these fantastic independent providers and are now thinking about, hey, is it easier for me to just go with the default option that comes with my enterprise system? And obviously the independent providers are now desperately, like you mentioned, trying to become a platform themselves, right? And taking up more and more of the workflow. So how do you resolve that tension without just always just defaulting to what's easiest?
Yeah. So what's easiest, and I I think it's important that we kind of put kind of a point on that, is
Yeah.
always something that reduces the time for a physician to provide the same or better level of care, right?
Okay.
That's always how we're really thinking about this, is like that's how physicians adopt things. And that's why I think ambient listening was such a huge kind of massive win for folks. It's like, well, I don't have to write my documentation anymore. Wow,
Mm.
that's me hours. I mean, I can potentially take on more patients. Nobody really wanted to say that, but
Yeah.
CFOs wanted that. Physicians maybe didn't really want that,
Yeah.
right? But there's a lot of unintended effects when you have that easy integration on
Yeah.
that side. Is that you're just like, oh, this is just going to save a lot of time, but at what cost? Right.
Yeah.
So now a lot more physicians are asking about ambient listening. Am I really understanding patients in the same way, or am I just offloading some of this cognitive effort to a scribe that I can't guarantee is going to write up the way that the visit worked exactly the way I did? Or, okay, well, I saved, 10 minutes on writing this note, but I'm spending 7 minutes on editing this note because, I have to still read through and all of that. We're still seeing uneven pieces in primary care versus inpatient versus nurses versus, all these other folks. It just, a lot of the cognitive labor shifts other places, right?
Mm.
It's not necessarily something that is always kind of a reduction fully. It's just where are you putting the focus again? So that the ambient listening side is very easy because it's very good and very simple. Everybody realized that we can do that, and Epic's now doing that as well with their solution. And so now they have to build a bigger platform to offload more and more of that work from the physician to kind of maintain that level of excitement at a high $100, plus a month per physician price, right? So, it's a double-edged sword. The flip side of that is a company that adds a bit of friction up front where you have to change up the workflow, but downstream is a real benefit. This was for us with Artria,
Mm.
in Australia, where it was, they came in with a platform that we thought would be competitive with a HeartFlow and save us time on plaque analysis and flow rate, on those pieces. It turned out to be a huge foundational win on reading coronary CTs, to the point in which our cardiologists are saving 50 to 80% of their time compared to the existing Philips system on reading these CCTAs.
Oh,
And
wow.
they were not prescribing CTs. They were doing stress tests. They were doing a lot of other things, right? That were not necessarily showing the full piece of coronary artery disease on that side because it was just simpler to do. And they could get them out of the health system a little bit quicker when there's just undifferentiated chest pain and we're really not sure. But it was not indicative of whether there was broader heart disease there. And so now, yes, we're having to convince our folks that, well, yes, you've seen the results in terms of reading the CT scans. It's a lot less time. Let's prescribe more CT scans. So you change the dominant way of looking at these particular patients that are coming in. That was really hard for our TRIA to do, but it creates an immense amount of stickiness afterwards that, the easy win doesn't necessarily provide. So maybe that provided a little bit of kind of the answer to the question. It's hard because either way, you see the friction exist in one way or the other. It's just at what part of the client deliverable do you want to have it become a flashpoint?
Yeah, and uh, I completely appreciate the perspective, although I'm going to push back slightly in that I completely understand, particularly the clinician framing of what you said around, look, fundamentally, health system is always, well, no, you said the health system will always be optimized to allow the clinician to deliver the same or better level of care as easy or as efficiently as possible. However, the clinician is not the only one that makes technology decisions. And technology decisions don't only have clinical ramifications. Security, costs, all sorts of other things, tech strategy, vendor lock-in, interoperability, etc. And, it's not an unknown thing that a clinical champion goes to a conference, meets a vendor, sees a product that they love, they come back and they bang on the door of the CIO, say, we have to work with this company. And the CIO says, no go, for these reasons, right? Epic already does it. It's not SOC 2, it's not this or that or whatever. It's not easy for me, for the CIO or the IT team or whoever, general counsel or whatever. How do you resolve those tensions? Right. When, the clinician says like a clinician could say, look, hey, I love our trio. And IT or radiology IT or whoever's involved is like, hey, well, we've already got an implementation. This is new work for us. And the fact that you get the results, 50% faster, or you read CCs 50% faster, doesn't benefit me as someone who has to do the integration. How do you resolve those challenges?
But isn't that the entire thing where we go back to the beginning around your champion, right?
Yeah.
Is that they don't know how to buy. They need to
Mm,
find the effective champion that can straddle that and figure out what is going to get the CIO to yes. Because by default, IT is always overloaded. There's
yeah.
always a new solution. The Epic does this already is really a convenient answer for I don't want to put this on my priority list that is already 200 things long, right?
Yeah.
And Epic, I think, plays into it by saying if you're buying from Epic, if you're not buying from Epic, you're buying it twice, right? So
Mm,
good on them, right? You need to be able to kind of maintain your market position in that way. But a lot of it is a convenient reason to say no. The SOC 2 compliance, oh, it's hosted as opposed to on prem. There's so many reasons why you can get to know, but a lot of it is how is the clinician able to work with their business leader? How are they able to work with finance? How are they able to do all of those things to get to yes? That's not easy. And in many ways, your startup founder has to be
mm,
the one to teach them how to buy.
yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's the hardest part is that if you are a startup founder that doesn't understand healthcare, you're coming from a tech background and you don't know how to buy within a health system, how are you going to be able to get it through the door unless you get fantastically lucky with the person that you've met that knew how to buy? You found that lottery ticket in the organization that did it. So you're going to have to learn from folks that have done it before on teaching folks how to get through the system.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. I'm always in awe of other founders who don't come from a healthcare background. I've spent my entire life inside hospitals. I don't know anything different. And even for me, it can be daunting. Whereas, yeah, like I said, I'm in awe of other founders who try to do this without coming from that insider background.
I mean, there's a reason why, once you get to Series A, Series B funding, in health tech companies, after you have those first few
Mm,
large enterprise customers, it's just pouring fuel on the fire. The valuations start going up a bit more because once you get into the health system, it's very sticky. Churn's very low. Contract values are high. There's good amount of opportunity for upsells. You have the relationships already there.
mm.
it's a great customer to have, assuming you can acquire the customer efficiently. Acquiring the customer efficiently, well, that's the name of the game. That's how you
Yeah.
figure out how to get past that. How do you achieve that minor miracle, and then you can get to
Yes.
solving the next miracle?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And then specifically on the Artria use case, like we were mentioning earlier, like a lot of the challenges that most health systems are facing, but particularly in the US, are driving some of the operational
Mhm.
AI, rev cycle, call center, scheduling, that sort of stuff. Clinical AI has been a bit of a laggard, and I think particularly actually in the US. So, what do you think was effective in creating trust internally when deploying Artria, particularly making the clinicians comfortable and getting such good results now?
Yeah, so our tree is an interesting one because there was already, existing precedent around some of their plaque work and all of
Oh,
that
yes. Yeah.
Workflow already spent a lot of money educating the market on why
Yeah.
this was very important, right? And a fast
Yeah.
follow in some of these is sometimes exactly what you need, right?
Yeah.
In our Tria's case, it was the efficiency side. I think the price was also a pretty large factor, in that way. And I think that was one where, all of the benefits seemed to align in a way that it worked. Clinical AI is it's lagging in the US for a couple of reasons. I think number one, there's a lot of there's a lot of uncertainty around liability here and who actually owns a lot of this. So, you have clinical decision support, right? Spans the gamut from kind of making a small recommendation. Does that need to be FDA approved all the way into like full on medical device? Like we need to have this approval fully. And there's a lot of middle ground in that. So a lot of hospitals that, hey, rather than trying to build out an infrastructure, like Newton's tree around this to manage this, right? We're just going to put our heads in the sand and kind of go with what we're being told Epic is doing. But there's a lot of stuff that Epic is doing that straddles the line a little bit too. And everybody kind of knows that. But because, there's kind of a real benefit to having this level of information, we all just go with the flow. The operational pieces, we don't really have to deal with the liability as much. Yeah, AI call center routes call and we don't get the outcome as quickly as we wanted and we had to route it to a physical person to answer the question when AI could have done it. Yeah, that's not the worst thing in the world, but if we're, automating 30, 40, 50% of our calls elsewhere, we're seeing the benefit down the line. The clinical liability piece, if something goes wrong, people could die. And, everybody is very risk averse when it comes to adopting those types of things, unless there is that massive efficiency piece, right? You have still the human in the loop, whatever that means. I know there's kind of really a range of what human in the loop actually looks like,
Yeah.
right? But the efficiency tends to trump most other things when it comes to the way communities are buying. But I talk to a lot of community health systems that are like, hey, we work with Meditech. They're not set up to enable a lot of these AI solutions in the way that we want. Sorry, we just can't adopt it yet. Or there's a lot of health systems that are, well, we're still on the managed services train, right? We're just going to see how that goes for as long as possible. Um, the AI world is exciting right now, but it's a bit kind of spiky in terms of who's adopting and who's not. You have organizations that are doing hundreds of AI pilots
Yes.
right now, and you have organizations that are just like, well, maybe we'll consider ambient listing next year. But you're going to start seeing market dynamics go towards those organizations that either create the efficiencies or have the types of tools in place that help their staff members, where staff and when they're thinking about their next role, they're going to those places where they can be on the
Yeah.
front lines.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, you're completely right. And then I mean, you raised a couple of really interesting challenges around the sort of governance implications of some of these systems, and just in general, like the total cost of ownership of AI. And we're often bad at this, or some people are at least. Whenever you implement a technology, you often only think about the technology rather than everything it takes to get it in and then to keep it alive. And so then, as health systems, appreciating your comment that adoption is spiky, but a lot of health systems are actually deploying a lot of AI, in parallel simultaneously across different service lines. Is governance now becoming a bigger issue than the products themselves?
So I think folks are just realizing, especially the folks that are on the front edge of, I'm piloting dozens of tools right now, and I'm just not really sure where all it is, because there's a lot of budget lines, there's a lot of promises about what a ROI is going to look like, what
Yeah.
performance improvement's going to look like. I think there's just more like, hey, are we a little bit over our skis on this one? It's kind of like the advent of cloud, when we started
Yeah.
having a lot more cloud solutions, like, oh, are we a little bit over our skis? Like, did we have the right security things in place? Have we done all that? And there was a bit of a ratcheting back. Some of it is, Joint Commission, or, other folks are saying, like, you need to have these types of things in place. But I think that when you're looking at it from an IT perspective, it's not just on the implementation side, it's also on the maintenance side that becomes a real issue. And so everybody's thinking about the implementation. There are a lot of failures on the AI on that side. And we talked about the workflow integration and all those other things that are not necessarily connected to IT, but still matter very much,
Yeah.
right? You can't get to the scaling point, right? And so when people do get to scale, that's great. But then they realize, like, oh, I'm at scale now. What do I do on maintenance? What does this mean afterwards? Like, can I sustain the same level of support or same level of insight, right? That this AI tool, promised a year ago versus now? Are they changing their models underneath? Is there some sort of drift, or my population's changing? Like all of these types of things. And so I think most folks were like, well, let me see if some of these scale first, and then I'll get into the governance side of it. And that's the way most health systems went. I think for us is because I like to treat Healthliant Ventures and kind of the Tanner piece there as like, what happens if it was my own startup, right? What is the thing I need to think about down the line that is going to keep me up at night? I think we thought about it a little earlier, because it was, okay, well, I know that I can have 10 investment partnerships every year, or 15 investment partnerships every year. How am I going to either implement or maintain that long term, so that I know that I'm porting on the right things? And that's one of the reasons we just had to think about it a little bit more, because we were more intentional about going after those AI projects, as opposed to a lot of health systems, which have somewhat unintentionally gotten dozens of AI
Yeah.
projects. And now there are IT leaders or AI leaders
Yeah.
that are like, how do we put the genie back in the bottle?
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, that exactly it. It reminds me, especially when you're talking about drift and changes, I was giving a lecture yesterday at the Royal Society of Medicine in London, and I use this example of a patient using ChatGPT to do a drug conversion from dihydrocodeine to oxycodone. And I actually did it with two different versions of ChatGPT. So I had an old case study from GPT 3.5, and then I updated it with GPT 5.5,
Yeah.
which is the most recent model. The dose in oxycodone that it recommends between those two versions is 100 times different. In the first version, it was 2.4 grams, which is 100 times lethal overdose. And actually, the most recent version of GPT actually gives you the correct dosage, which
Well, that's good.
you should be using it for that, but it's good. At least getting
Yeah.
better. It took a couple of years. And so now that one is you have this like rapidly shifting landscape, not only vendors shifting, but the technology from the same vendor shifting. And then also you have CIOs trying to put things back in the bottle, the genie back in the bottle. What does responsible AI deployment look like from the perspective of a health system operator? What does meaningful oversight look like for a health system?
Okay, so I want to get to that broader question. I think your point about the chat GPT dosing piece is very important. And there's a lot
Yeah.
of health systems that are trying to figure this out right now. I look at this maybe a little bit differently than most. So we've had folks in our health system, I've heard from other health systems, is like, we need our own version of chat GPT, right? That somebody can like interface with the health system to start like self triaging in some way or get the advice. And my point on that, and maybe I'm against most of my peers in my health system and otherwise, is we're not going to be able to out distribute Anthropic or OpenAI. People are just going to go to Chat GPT. So how can we either make, it's like, hey, I'm looking for a physician now because I've got this weird rash. How can I make sure that if they're in our area that they come to Tanner, right? You have to exist in the tools that are already there, rather than trying to force a tool on somebody that they're just not going to. That's just not realistic. And so I use that as kind of a focusing and like a lens on your broader comment about responsible AI deployment.
Mm.
is an understanding that you are not going to be able to control all aspects of this as much as you can, right? Because there's different consumer behaviors that you are at the whim of that side. You try to protect as much as you can. It's like a security environment right now with, everybody's now looking at weird phishing emails, but I'm very sensitive to the fact of if somebody calls me on the phone with my CEO's name and it sounds like him asking me to do something, that's a little scary. I mean, I think I'm pretty good at catching that stuff, but I don't know. You have to put up the safeguards as much as you can on that type of deployment. The clinical side is how do you engage clinicians, keep them in the loop on that side? How do you constantly present data to them about what's going well, what's not going well? Do you have leaders on your team that are utilizing AI in an effective way, or are they just really saying, well, I'm using kind of the rewrite function on chat GPT to make my email sound better. No, it's people that are keeping up with agentic and all of these other new pieces. Those have to be the folks that are curious about what's going to go wrong on that side. But tech is always going to be further along than what health systems are able to realistically consume. Even the most kind of forward thinking health systems are going to have problems with this because if you're on the cutting edge of that stuff, I would ask, why are you working at a health system? That's not me insulting health systems. It's
No,
just a realistic assessment of you as an employee. If you're that valuable, why are you not at OpenAI getting $1 million stock package?
yeah. Yeah, and fundamentally, health systems are in the business of delivering care, not developing cutting edge technology. Well,
It's
only in as
hard.
far as it delivers care. Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, it's why we've outsourced to enterprise vendors for so many years because we assume that the Microsofts of the world, the Epics of the world are going to be responsible in how they do this. We've essentially said, well, Epic's going to do it right. Well,
Yeah.
nobody got fired trusting Epic. I think that's just generally where a lot of folks are right.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Steve, you've been very generous with your time. Before we wrap up, I want to ask one last question, which
Sure.
is what advice would you give to healthcare leaders, health system leaders who may be playing a similar role to you, but ultimately are responsible for the AI agenda at their institution? How do they navigate the AI wave without sort of getting lost in the hype?
Yeah. I think that the big thing is we're starting to see a big push from point solutions to patterns, right? So before you start adopting things, solutions that solve particular pain points make, on a step of A, B, C, and D, make steps B and C and the piece there that much more efficient. Think about the patterns that are breaking down in a lot of ways. This is one of the reasons that we built out our career development because we're looking at our workforce challenges and it's not just nursing turnover. It's not just our nutrition services turning over. It's, well, what's going to be the broader pattern of AI disruption? How do we connect that to analytics, to all of these other things that are going to be really important? It's starting to see the forest through the tree. And it's almost like the token maxing phase right now is that
Yeah.
you can token max all you want and go after point solutions until the cows come home. But how many of those folks are going to be able to evolve into the platform and the relationship that long term are going to be important? So I would say it's a bit more breathe. We don't have to be in the pure hype cycle
Yeah.
anymore in the way that we were maybe a year, 2 years ago. We have to take a step back and say, well, what do I think our clinical AI use cases are? What do we think our operational AI use cases are? We have enough data now from doing these programs that we can step back and say, this was worth it, this wasn't, and really change our search methodology accordingly moving forward. So that would be the one thing. I know it may sound very high level and everybody's going to look a little bit differently at it, but it's important to catch your breath before really jumping into the breach on something that looks very exciting, but I will tell you a lot of times doesn't necessarily work as quickly or as comprehensively as you'd like it to.
Brilliant. Thanks, Steve. This conversation was fantastic. And it's largely because of that last point, in that is grounded in operational reality, particularly for systems like yours, regional community systems that don't have infinite resources, but still have to deliver world-class care. So really appreciate you joining us. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.